Our topic this evening is, what are saints? So within Christianity, there is a very long and very broad tradition of saints, including the veneration of saints. But it is also a cause of conflict within Christianity as, especially in modern era, the different branches of Christianity, especially Protestants and the child branches off of Protestantism, often have very negative vision of saints, whereas other traditions, Catholics and Eastern Orthodox and Oriental Orthodox, continue to maintain saints as an important part of their Christian tradition. So I want to try to look at this and look at it throughout the historical context. So when we're looking at a word like this, obviously the beginnings of Christianity aren't in English, and so we want to look back to the Greek and the Latin. And so the English word saint comes for us from the Latin word sanctus, which means holy. It's an adjective, which means holy. And we have a bunch of words that come from that to us. So when we talk about an inner sanctum, you can hear the word holy there, sanctum being an adjective describing a holy place. And in that is itself the equivalent of the Greek word haios or haia, and again an adjective depending on if it is modifying a masculine, feminine, or neuter noun. So Hagia Sophia being holy wisdom, the great cathedral in Constantinople. So while the adjective holy in English, and its Greek and Latin equivalents here, can be applied to places and objects, when the word has come into English as saint, it refers specifically to a holy person. So we have an informal usage. We say, oh, well, she's a real saint. And we don't mean that in any kind of technical sense. We mean this is a person who's a really good person, or maybe a long-suffering person. And so in other words, we're making an informal comparison to this more formal idea that we may have of what a saint is. And so, for example, Francis of Assisi is usually not, people probably don't usually just say Francis of Assisi like that. They'll tend to just say Saint Francis. And everybody pretty well knows who Saint Francis is, as he remains an incredibly popular medieval religious activist who is also understood to be a saint within the Christian tradition. So in the Latin West, when we're looking at that formal idea of what is a saint, or who can officially be called a saint, that idea developed over the centuries into a system, and it's a system of, it's called canonization. Canon means a regular, according to a rule, according to a law. So when you are, according to church law, canonized, you go through a fourfold process in the Latin West, process that can take years or even centuries. And so in the first place, the candidate for sainthood after their death is subjected to an investigation. And if it passes through that first stage of it, they're declared venerable, which means, someone whose life was worthy of veneration. Next level of investigation leads to a status or a title of being called blessed, and so beatus in Latin, so beatification. And then finally, in the last stage of investigation, once a blessed person is being considered for canonization, they have to have had, in the Catholic tradition, 2 important miracles ascribed to that saintly intervention in order to achieve full canonization, in order to achieve sainthood. And so back in the case of Saint Francis, who was popular not only in his, in the time period ever since his death, was actually very popular in his own life, the contemporary Pope, Gregory IX, declared Francis a saint just 2 years after Francis's death. So that did not take a full long time in order for that whole process of investigation, which might have been simpler still in the 13th century. So we're about to have, I guess, our first millennial to be named a saint in the Catholic Church. So a young man named Carlo Acutis, who died at the age of 15 of leukemia. He can serve for us, I think, as an example of the current canonization procedures of the Catholic Church. So in life, Acutis was a religiously devout teenager, and he was very interested in Marian apparitions, for example. That is to say, when people report visions or even visitations with Mary, the mother of Jesus, Mary, the mother of God, the Catholic tradition, or also people who report miracles that relate to the Eucharist, relate to the emblems of the sacrament of the Lord's Supper, the sacrament of the communion in the Catholic tradition. And as a young man, he was also a web designer, kind of a tech geek, and he used his skills in communication to transmit kind of his fervor and understanding of the Catholic faith to a younger generation. And so he's already gone through those first stages, and he's now beatified, and he's scheduled to be fully canonized by Pope Francis in April, so very soon. So this is a picture of his tomb, which is in the sanctuary of the Spoliation, a 12th century church in Assisi. So his final wish was to be buried in Assisi, and that wish was granted, and he now has a very special tomb there where people come in order to pray and to venerate his relics here, in order to seek, in a lot of cases, healing or healing for someone else, so to seek intercession. So what is this thing about having to have 2 or more miracles? Well, this understanding of miracles relates to the spiritual practice of the veneration of the saints, something that goes back to the beginning of Christianity, and also to this general idea of saints, the spirit of saints who are departed, as being in heaven and therefore being able to act as intercessors with God. And so in the case of Carlo Acutis here, one of the miracles that has been investigated in his canonization process took place in Brazil. So there was a mother who had a son who was born with some kind of a pancreatic defect that had prevented him from eating solid food, up until the very beginning of his early life. And then she prayed to Acutis, asking that for an intercession, asking so that it would be, the child would have some relief from this. After which, immediately thereafter, the child was able to actually begin to eat solid food. And so that is understood then to have been intercession, a miracle, a healing. And so this is actually, I guess, a reliquary where either the whole heart, I don't know, or part of Carlo Acutis' heart is being saved and preserved outside of the rest of the body that we saw in the tomb. So this is, again, a long-standing practice of taking different parts of the saints' remains and putting them in special reliquaries so that they can also, you don't have to go all the way to Assisi. Maybe this could be in a different shrine someplace else. Okay, so we have to kind of take off. If you're raised Protestant or from a Protestant descended tradition like I was, I think you have to remove our Protestant lenses when we start to examine this, because I think the idea of maintaining, let's say, the corpse, body parts, even just the possessions of somebody who's died, keeping those as relics, maybe seems pretty alien to those of us outside of the tradition, and like I say, especially Protestant-derived churches. And in that, I would also include, even though it's not a church anymore, it's never meant to be a church, agnosticism and atheism in the Western tradition, because those also primarily evolved out of the same general trend line of Protestantism. So people who left the Catholic Church, entered Protestant churches, continued to purge, and some of them became deists, and then from becoming deists, agnostics and atheists, with some of that same roots and trajectory. So I want to, in this lecture, examine this practice of the veneration of saints within, including the relics, within this larger tradition of sainthood. So these are, we saw this modern reliquary for Carlo Acutis. So this is a long-standing tradition. So this is a 14th century Byzantine reliquary containing, according to the tradition, according to whoever was making the reliquary at that time, the arms of Saint Anne, who is essentially according to Christian tradition, the mother of Mary, the mother of Jesus. How did this idea get started? These are really strange, right? So here's a foot reliquary. So this one is made to look like a foot, but it's actually only just holding a piece of bone from one of the feet. Again, according to tradition of the Apostle St. James the Greater. And I say according to tradition is because we don't have, for anybody that's going to go all the way back to the lifetime of Jesus, like the apostles, we have no provenance to identify them. And St. James in particular, there's a lot of different remains for St. James in different places, but the most prominent place in Spain at Santiago doesn't have very good provenance, I would say. So where does this idea of sainthood get started, or where does this word or usage of the word saint, the understanding of saint, get started? So saint, in fact, is a very early name by which Christians used to call each other, specifically before they used this term, before they had coined the word Christians. So by the time we get to the 2nd century, Christians were widely known by that name, Christian. But the term was not yet coined in the lifetime of the historical Jesus of Nazareth. So when Jesus was walking around Galilee, or when he went to Jerusalem leading his movement, nobody said, oh, here's the Christians, they've all shown up. That name hadn't been made up yet. It was not applied yet. It's only after Jesus' death and after his disciples report visions of the risen Christ, experiences with the risen Christ, it's only then that they then identify Jesus as the Christ, or the Messiah, and Christ in Greek, and then because they talk about that all the time, all of the non-Christians start calling them, okay, those are those Christ people, these Christians, who won't shut up about this idea of Christ. So as a result, other than in the headings, for example, and notes added later, where headings in the New Testament will talk about Christians or the way to do this as a Christian or something like that. That's an addition. The word Christian itself appears very, very rarely in the texts of the New Testament. So it occurs first in the book of Acts, in Acts chapter 11, verse 25 and 26, which says, "Then Barnabas, one of the disciples, went to Tarsus to look for Saul," his name is later Paul, "and when he found him, he brought him back to Antioch. So it was that for an entire year they met with the church and taught a great many people." And then it says this little detail here, "And it was in Antioch that the disciples were first called Christians." So up until that time, like I say, in the whole lifetime of the historical Jesus, even according to biblical texts, that was not a term that anybody was using. So whether or not Acts is historically correct that the term Christian was first coined in Antioch, and it's certainly possible. So Antioch was the capital of Roman Syria, one of the most important eastern metropolises. And it was also the site of an important Christian community where both Paul was active and also Peter, one of the historical disciples of the historical Jesus. Both of them were active in Antioch. And so this name Christian anyway became widespread after Jesus' death. The book of Acts itself only uses the word one additional time. So somebody says, you almost persuade me to be a Christian. And it doesn't exist anywhere else in the New Testament with the exception of one mention in the first epistle of Peter. In that writing, the letter, it says, if any of you suffers as a Christian, do not consider it a disgrace, but glorify God because you bear this name. And so, again, because there's no other use of this word, early on in the New Testament, it's a later word. The idea that the historical Peter would be saying this probably is an anachronism. This all by itself wouldn't disqualify the epistles of Peter from being, actually written by Peter, but everything about them are anachronistic, and scholars do not think that Peter wrote either of them. So these are pseudepigrapha. They're written in Peter's name, and again, this is one of the examples of how they're written later, in a later date. So, however, Paul, who is the first Christian whose writings survive, who wrote long before the book of Acts was composed, and long before the movement adopted the name Christian, Paul then, instead of the word Christian, uses the word saint or saints to describe the members of the churches that he is planting in his many letters to those churches. So, for example, in his first epistle to the Corinthians, Paul writes to the people he's writing to. He addresses them to the church of God that is in Corinth, to those who are sanctified in Christ Jesus, called to be saints, together with all those who in every place call on the name of our Lord Jesus Christ. So, he's not saying to the Christian church. It doesn't say that anywhere. It's the church of God in Corinth and the people there who are called to be saints. He refers to various Christian churches as churches of the saints in that letter. And he also talks about a church of Christians in Jerusalem, the church that is led by Jesus' brother, James the Just, for whom Paul has been taking up a collection, collecting alms. He calls those folks the saints of Jerusalem, or sometimes the poor and the saints of Jerusalem. So, for example, in 1 Corinthians 16, he says, now concerning the collection for the saints, you should follow the directions that I gave to the churches of Galatia. On the first day of every week, each of you is to put aside and save whatever extra you can, so that collections need not be taken when I come. And when I arrive, I will send any whom you approve with letters to take your gift to Jerusalem. So this is a collection for the saints, and that is to say the members of the church in Jerusalem. He uses the same language when talking about his collection in his letter to the Christians in Rome. Again, before they have the name Christian, they're the members of the church in Rome. He says Macedonia and Achaia, that is to say, the churches in Greece and the Balkans, were pleased to share their resources with the poor among the saints at Jerusalem. So again, with the saints in Jerusalem are also sometimes called the poor of Jerusalem, but in general, Paul is just referring to anybody who's a member of the church as saints. So Paul and those writing in his name make frequent use of this term saints as a shorthand to describe members of their movement, members of their church. And so if we look at all of the letters that are attributed to Paul that make their way into the New Testament, Galatians, 1 Thessalonians, 1 Corinthians, Philippians, Philemon, 2 Corinthians, and Romans, those are the ones that scholars generally all agree the historical Paul wrote. He doesn't use the word in Galatians, but in the others he uses it once, 6 times, twice, 5 times, and 8 times. Philemon is a really short letter, and it gets twice in there. Then in the kind of disputed letters, Colossians, 2 Thessalonians, Ephesians, 3, 1, and 9 times. And then in the ones that most people don't think Paul wrote, 1 and 2 Timothy and Titus, it's not as much used, but it does make its appearance once in 1 Timothy. In other words, this is something that that's his general shorthand. He's not using another name more often. This is the name that he has for the people who are members of the movement. It's not simply a quirk of Paul. So the anonymous author of Hebrews also has the same usage. So he calls the members there saints, as does the author of Jude. And Jude is a really short letter, but it comes not from the Pauline tradition, but from the Jacobin tradition, the Jamesian church tradition, that group of the poor of Jerusalem who may or may not have been, we think probably were, antagonistic, the main antagonists of Paul. So in Jude, we read, "Beloved, while eagerly preparing to write you about the salvation we share, I find it necessary to write and appeal to you to contend for the faith that was once and for all handed on to the saints." So it's handed to us, the members of this church. Well, we would now say handed on to Christians, but back then they don't have that word, so using the word saints. The same moniker, the same shorthand is known in the Johannine church, the Johnian community, and we have the word saints appearing 15 times in the book of Revelation, the book of John the Revelator, John of Patmos. So much more frequent use than the limited use of the word Christian in the New Testament. So it's true also, though, that within the New Testament church's usage of the term as a name for members of the early church, there's also an aspirational meaning. So you're still saying that we're being set apart as holy. So this is a designation that members are trying to live up to. You hope to be worthy of being called saints, of being called sanctified. So over time, when there's this new word, Christian, and that comes to displace saints, the old term remains. So people continue to talk about the saints, but they use it less to talk about contemporary members. Now we call the contemporary members Christians. And instead, they equate the saints with the earliest members. And they also, their tradition continues to develop that many of those earliest members, or indeed over time, all of those earliest members are understood to have been martyrs. And so, for example, St. Ignatius here, early bishop of Antioch, is being depicted in this icon, killed by lions in an amphitheater. And there becomes a widespread tradition that more or less all of the earliest members, meet those kind of fates as martyrs. And again, early members then are equated with saint. Saint is equated with martyr over time. An example of how that works is St. Peter's traditional end. So St. Peter, although again this story does not make its way into the New Testament, it is not found in the New Testament, later tradition says that he eventually made his way to Rome, where he was crucified upside down in the circus of Nero. So one of these, not in the amphitheater, killed by lions, but in this case crucified in another public venue. And then that circus of Nero later becomes the place where a tomb and a shrine to Peter are, and ultimately in the 4th century where old St. Peter's was built, and now you can see superimposed over this where St. Peter's and the Vatican are today, where originally the circus of Nero had been. So, if we see Christian tradition as something that is continually evolving naturally, and I'm showing that in this arrow through time with a spectrum. So everything is kind of building on itself and it's moving in a direction, and then something else moves. There's continuity and innovation both together over time. But one of the things that happens when you have an artifact that comes from a particular time is that it reflects that time. And so, for example, the New Testament, the biblical usage of the word saints, meaning members of the church, that really only applies to that first period of time when those texts are from. So like I say, the biblical usage of the word then is a record or a fossil that records that earliest usage and stage of the tradition a tradition and a evolving meaning that goes on through Christian history to the present. As members, like I say, adopted the word Christian to identify themselves, so that became what they called each other in the contemporary times. Like I say, they increasingly reserved that name saints to refer to the early members of the church who died or were presumed to have died as martyrs, along with, let's say, their contemporaries in the present day who suffered similar fates. And so I was even saying that in our informal usage, we say, well, she's an incredible saint. She's a real saint because of her being long-suffering. She's especially holy. So you could still be using that for contemporaries, but doesn't mean all of us. We wouldn't necessarily all call or want to be called saints because we maybe would have more humility than that. So the ongoing evolution of the tradition, Christian tradition is understood to be one of the pillars of authority in the Catholic Church. That has continuity across history, as we'll see later in the presentation, and that has informed the contemporary Catholic understanding of saints and the spiritual practice of veneration that has brought us to that example that I showed at the very beginning of the first millennial who was going to be officially canonized in the Catholic Church this year. So the present Catholic understanding of saints built on that tradition, not entirely the same as the use of the word certainly back in the Bible, or the understanding of the early Christians at the time of the martyrdoms, or when they were looking back to a tradition of the martyrdoms, but built on all of that and everything that goes in between. The Protestant Reformation in the 16th century rejected tradition itself as a source of authority. So Protestants started looking at tradition's mutability, and they felt that made it suspect. So in the same way that if you have a written record, you can say this is how things actually happened. If you're relying on oral tradition is able to evolve with the times. It can preserve very ancient stuff, but it can also dynamically change. The written text is dead text. It only changes in terms of its interpretation changes because you don't understand its context anymore and that sort of a thing. So Protestants also made kind of the partisan argument that under this broad banner of tradition, pagan practices had gotten smuggled into Christianity, and they wanted to purge the religion of those kinds of anything that smelled of paganism. And so that's part of the goal. And so as a result of that, through the rejection of tradition, Protestants eliminated that living continuity and instead elevated and adopted Scripture, the written record from the earliest time, as the sole source of authority for the church. So Scripture now, sola scriptura, is the doctrine of authority. And one of the things that's very hard for anybody who's raised Christian, especially raised Protestant in the 20th and 21st centuries, to grasp is how alien a total Bible-focused Christianity would have been through most of the Christian tradition. The Bible would always have been important, one of the sources of authority. Now it's brought to be from important to a new status of all important. So why did they do that? Well, the Reformation itself, like every movement throughout history, is a product of its own historical context. And so it's no coincidence at all that the Reformation focus on the Bible corresponded with the contemporary development of the printing press and the ability for a wider population to own books for the very first time, and therefore for literacy broadly to spread out from an elite clerical caste to just being common everyday use, so that everybody themselves were able to have direct access unmitigated access, no intercessor between you and the text, and that also informs, again, the Protestant values that emerge here. Protestantism didn't just stay in like one church, so it's not like there's just a schism that involved, now there's an Eastern Orthodox Church and a Catholic Church and a Protestant church. Protestants immediately atomized into all kinds of different denominations and sects. And so as Protestants divided in schism, many justified their rejection of tradition as a source of authority by positing that Christianity itself had been a true movement during the apostolic age, those first generations of the disciples immediately in the immediate aftermath of Christ and the resurrection, but sometime thereafter had fallen into an apostasy, a great apostasy, almost certainly having something to do with Constantine, the Roman emperor, co-opting Christianity and making it the state religion of an empire. That clearly by that time the true church had gone off the rails and it was no longer true at all. So reformers like Alexander Campbell in the 19th century, early 19th century in the United States, sought to restore then that original or primitive Christian tradition that had existed in the first century. And he did so not only by taking the New Testament text as the sole source of authority, but by really trying to do everything, every part of practice, every part of worship, every understanding of offices, everything that you do as a Christian be done in imitation of things that are actually described in the New Testament, especially in the book of Acts or in Paul's letters. And so you don't want to have priesthood. You don't want to have priesthood offices that aren't described or mentioned in the New Testament. You don't want to have rituals that aren't there. You want to maybe restore rituals that you read about there that don't have any contemporary practice, like feet washing or something like that. And so restorationism is essentially another layer to the trajectory that the Protestant Reformation started. So I'm just going to make a further tangent here, so into the idea of restoration. So Alexander Campbell was the founder of the Stone Campbell movement that led to the disciples of Christ and the Christian churches, that whole group. A close associate of Alexander Campbell, Sidney Rigdon, broke from him, and then later, first leading his own Church of Christ, but later merging his congregations into a church, another Church of Christ led by Joseph Smith Jr., who was also a restorationist, independent of the Stone Campbell movement in 1830. And then this created the Smith-Rigdon movement, as it's called by historian Stephen L. Shields, movement that's also popularly known as Mormonism or the Latter-day Saint restoration tradition. And so that grows out of this merger of Sidney Rigdon's group coming together with Joseph Smith's group. Like the Campbellites, Smith and Rigdon called their church the Church of Christ, but because that's such a generic name, none of their contemporaries called them by that name, and instead, because Joseph Smith had published a new book of scripture called the Book of Mormon, that provided a ready name to identify this group. And so everybody who wasn't a member of the movement started calling the people in the church the Mormonites or the Mormons. Mormons didn't like this, and so to avoid this moniker, members went back to what they liked to do, which was find names from the New Testament. And so that usage of the word saints to refer to members of the church that's found in Paul and other New Testament sources, they use that to coin a new name for themselves, the Latter-day Saints. So the members believed that their church was a restoration of the primitive church, whose members called themselves saints, and thus the only difference was that some of the saints had lived in ancient times, And some of the saints lived now in these latter days. And so this is where the term Latter-day Saints comes from. So my own church, for most of its history, is called the Reorganized Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, which is just about the worst name for a church you can have. And to differentiate ourselves from our Utah cousins, the LDS Church, members of the RLDS Church first called themselves Reorganized Latter-day Saints. And as no one liked the big long name very much, there was an official attempt to rename the church and find a new name. And the Saints Church became an official nickname anyway, as people floated that. And so maybe the church would have been called the Saints Church. But eventually, in the year 2001, we settled on the more generic word name Community of Christ, which has the disadvantage of nobody remembers this as a name because, once again, it's too generic. So one of the reasons I think why Saints Church failed as a moniker, as a nickname, was that members are generally uncomfortable referring to themselves as saints. No one wants to say, hey, I'm a saint. Because the word saint has a much more common meaning today than just that narrow historic usage that's found in the New Testament. So if we look then at this tradition, again, going back to the spectrum of that early usage in the Bible, the later usage from the days of the martyrs, the break-off of Protestantism, and then the Restorationism. Within the Restoration tradition, saints, once again, are understood to be church members in ancient days and latter days, and yet there's this other meaning of saints that is more widely understood by the general population. So let's go back to that and look at models for the development then in the tradition of understanding saints as martyrs, saints as being especially long-suffering or devout or people worthy of emulation. So in the Bible itself, in the New Testament itself, after the examples of John the Baptist and Jesus, both of whom are executed by civil authorities, the book of Acts records what is really a template for the idea of saints dying as martyrs. That is to say, an early member of the movement who then seals his testimony in blood by being executed. And so Acts, the book of Acts, states that there was a member of the church, a saint named Stephen, who was a deacon, an important assisting leader in the church of Jerusalem. And Stephen was accused of blasphemy by Jewish authorities, and he was later stoned to death by a mob. And so he's known as Saint Stephen, and he's often called Stephen the proto-martyr, where proto-martyr means the first martyr, so the prototype of martyrdom. So after this long speech in the book of Acts that he has to the high priests in Jerusalem and the high council, where he just castigates them and all Jews for failing to recognize Jesus as the Messiah, Stephen concludes, "You stiff-necked people, uncircumcised in heart and ears, for you are forever opposing the Holy Spirit, just as your ancestors used to. Which of the prophets did your ancestors not persecute? They killed those who foretold the coming of the righteous one, and now you have become his betrayers and murderers. You are the ones who received the law as ordained by angels, and yet you have not kept it." So that's likely to win friends and persuade open hearts and minds and win a lot of converts, right? So actually, no, the castigation by Stephen understandably makes the council and the crowd mad. And so we read, "When they heard these things, they became enraged, and they ground their teeth at Stephen. But filled with the Holy Spirit, he gazed into heaven, and he saw the glory of God, and Jesus standing at the right hand of God. 'Look,' he said, 'I see the heavens opened, and the Son of Man standing at the right hand of God.' But they covered their ears, and with a loud shout all rushed together against him. they dragged him out of the city, and they began to stone him. And the witnesses laid their coats at the feet of a young man named Saul, who at this point is not part of the Christian movement, but later he's going to have a big change of heart and be converted and become Paul. So while they were stoning Stephen, Stephen prayed, "Lord Jesus, receive my spirit." Then he knelt down and cried out in a loud voice, "Lord, do not hold this sin against them." And when he'd said this, he died. So just as Jesus in the gospel accounts is nonviolent and is put to death, continuing to be nonviolent, and also then prays to the Father from the cross to forgive his executioners, so too the first Christian martyr, the prototype of martyrs here, Saint Stephen, follows that example, does likewise, and becomes a template for this. So while the historicity of Acts is often questionable, so we don't know for sure if Stephen is the first martyr, or if how much historicity that particular account has. And certainly, I should make the point here that later Christian tradition really exaggerated the extent of state-sponsored persecutions. In Christian martyrologies and hagiography, you get the impression that right from the foundation of Christianity up until Constantine's time, the Roman Empire was simply nonstop persecuting everybody everywhere. In fact, persecutions were often just localized. They were sometimes empire-wide, but they were therefore only happening temporarily. But nevertheless, sometimes in the debunking, people then say, well, there weren't really any martyrs, or this was not something that actually happened. No, there were plenty of Christian martyrs, and there were state-sponsored persecutions. They were just less widespread than later tradition had. And so we do have a lot of examples of Christians executed by the Roman state, usually on the grounds that they refused to offer sacrifices to the genius of the emperor, which is part of pagan tradition, which almost everybody in the Roman Empire was. It was no big deal to be able to raise a little bit of incense in front of the genius of the emperor. It was essentially understood to be a sign of patriotism, like taking a pledge of allegiance to a flag or something like that. But if you happen to be part of a religious tradition that refuses to take pledges, then you can't pledge allegiance to a flag. Usually so for example, in Canada, if you refuse to take oaths, they'll let you, when you're going into court, they'll let you affirm. You can take an oath on a piece of scripture, or maybe you just affirm something because you are opposed to oaths. The Roman Empire didn't have that exemption when they were going after Christians on the times that they were. So if we have, for example, a really good contemporary account of such a martyrdom for Saints Perpetua and Felicity, who were North African Christian women who were killed by wild beasts in Arena during a state persecution around the year 203. So we have an account by Perpetua and her scribe and continuer. So having been imprisoned alongside a number of other Christians, including Felicitas, who is a woman who is 8 months pregnant, Perpetua records, "One day while we were eating breakfast, we were suddenly hurried off for a hearing. We arrived at the forum, and straightway the story went about the neighborhood near the forum, and a huge crowd gathered. We walked up to the prisoner's dock. All the others, when questioned, admitted their guilt. Then, when it came my turn, my father appeared with my son, dragged me from the step and said, 'Perform the sacrifice, have pity on your baby.' So you have to just do this little thing to show that you're loyal to the genius of the emperor. So Hilarianus, the governor, who had received his judicial powers as the successor of the late proconsul Minucius Terminianus said to me, 'Have pity on your father's gray head. Have pity on your infant son. Offer the sacrifice for the welfare of the emperors.'" So, like I say, consistent with other sources, we see if a Christian is willing to recant, disclaim Christ, offer a sacrifice to the genius of the emperor, prove that they are, pagan enough to be loyal to the gods of Rome, they're going to be free to go. But she says, I will not. I retorted, are you a Christian? Asked Hilarianus, and she said, yes, I am. When my father persisted in trying to dissuade me, Hilarianus ordered him to be thrown on the ground and beaten with a rod. I felt sorry for father, just as if I myself had been beaten. I felt sorry for his pathetic old age. Then Hilarianus passed sentence on all of us. We were condemned to the beasts, and we returned to prison in high spirits. So Perpetua and her companions adhered to their convictions rather than do the easy way out and save their skin. Perpetua was also visionary, so she believed she had assurance of her vindication in a vision. And so she says, the day before we were to fight with the beasts, I saw the following vision. Pomponius the deacon came to the prison gates and began to knock violently. I went out and opened the gate for him. He was dressed in an unbelted white tunic, wearing elaborate sandals, and he said to me, Perpetua, come, we are waiting for you. Then he took my hand, and we began to walk through rough and broken country. At last we came to the amphitheater out of breath, and he led me to the center of the arena. Then he told me, do not be afraid, I am here, struggling with you. So she has this vision of assurance. There's nothing to be afraid of to die by the wild beasts eating her, because she will be vindicated eternally. So while persecutions were sporadic and often localized, they did result in thousands of martyrdoms over the course of 3 centuries. Many people in the audiences were impressed by the conviction of men and women like Perpetua, who were prepared to die rather than recant their profession of faith. And so the persecutions were thus often counterproductive from the perspective of the Roman government. Like we say, some non-Christian witnesses, like the character of Saul in Acts, who sees Stephen's proto-martyrdom, are ultimately impressed by the martyr's degree of spiritual conviction, and they in turn become Christians. Meanwhile, many Christians who didn't get killed took heart from their personal connection to the martyred saints, who they believed had been vindicated and had visions and were with God. After the Christianization of the Roman Empire, a Christian basilica with a special tomb for Saints Perpetua and Felicitas was built where the amphitheater of Carthage had been. And so you can see here the ruins of the amphitheater. In the middle of it there is this tomb, which is still present amid the ruins. And they were also added to a 4th century liturgical calendar in the city of Rome. So the city of Rome had a list of all of the different saints who had been martyred, who were venerated on various days. And Saints Perpetua and Felicity were honored on March 7th in that calendar, and continued to be for a whole long time. So let's look at this idea of what is happening on that special day or when you go to that tomb, the idea of intercession. So in the scripture accounts that we've had, when I read here about Stephen's martyrdom, both he and then also, if we think back to Jesus on the cross, as I mentioned, they both pray immediately prior to their death to the Father, please forgive them, they know not what they do, forgive their persecutors. So that's a intercessory prayer. I mean, it's before the saint has died, it's before the holy person has died, but they're right at the very end, praying to the Father for intercession on behalf of the persecutors. So when you were an ancient person, if you're living in this Roman Empire, a vast empire with a very distant monarch indeed, the idea of intercession would have been very familiar, extremely familiar. The emperor is incredibly remote. It's almost impossible to get his attention. But it's more conceivable that you might be able to have a courtier intercede on your behalf. So one of the companions of the emperor, somebody who has high office and who has occasion to meet with the emperor, maybe you can attract their attention some way and have a petition brought before the emperor in order to receive some kind of clemency or some kind of a favor. And so this is how intercession worked. And this had been kind of the basis of how Roman society operated, was a patron-client relationship where great patrons, the Roman nobles, had a whole host of friends who were less, at a lesser level for them, who could provide different services in return for, patronage, where that patron could then intercede with them, with the emperor or with the government and that kind of a thing. So if the emperor, the earthly emperor, is remote, how much more remote is the unseen King of heaven, is God? So in the account of his martyrdom that we read a few minutes ago in Acts, Saint Stephen, the proto-martyr, has a vision right before his death of Jesus as the Son of Man seated at the right hand of God. And so one could easily see how early Christians might pray to Jesus, because they affirm and have testimony and belief that Jesus is present with the Father. And they also come to understand that Jesus is God, just as the Father is God. And so maybe Jesus can intercede with them, with the unseen Father, who is generally in antiquity never even pictured. So we have this depiction of the unseen God from a mosaic in 6th century Ravenna, the hand of God, essentially. That's usually how the unseen creator, the source, is ever depicted. Nevertheless, Jesus is only relatively less remote. He's God's only begotten Son. He's the second person of the Trinity. He's seated at the right hand of the Father, God's glory made manifest. So Jesus Christ himself may seem also relatively remote and august. So again, following on that analogy, that would have been how ancient people framed, just viewed the universe based on the earthly imperial court, or later, as the late antiquity, the empire fell and there are medieval kingships that emerge, a royal court. Using that as a model for understanding the organization of heaven, Christian petitioners may well wonder, well, is there anybody else up there who might have more time to pay attention to somebody as unimportant as me? Who else might receive petitions? So that brings us to a kind of a theological question. What happens after death? Do the dead sleep in God's bosom, or are the spirits of the dead already in heaven? So in common with some of the other sects of Second Temple Judaism, for example, the Pharisees and the Essenes, who believed in a literal resurrection and also an apocalypse, an end of the world, many early Christians, especially in the first century, expected God would soon intervene in history. In fact, very soon, they thought, to end this unjust world that we were all sharing and create a new world in a very, very literal way. As far as they were concerned, this would include a physical resurrection of the dead. So the just would all come out of their graves, and they would then experience eternal life with God in this new creation. So this is a painting in the Sistine Chapel, Michelangelo's The Last Judgment. You can see in this little detail of it, the dead arising out of their tombs. Here's a same thing depicted in a 13th century illuminated manuscript. You can see kind of in the middle, the angels are blowing trumpets. The bodies are rising out of the graves in the middle of this. And then you're either going to be in the bosom of the Lord, as you can see up at the top, or in the maw of the devil down at the bottom. So the time between death and judgment for Christians in the first century, that might have seemed relatively negligible. Paul and many of his contemporaries pretty fervently believed that the end of the world would come very, very soon, probably in their own lifetimes. The author of Mark thought that as well, only to be proved wrong. As the interval then expanded from, well, it's going to be in a few years, well, maybe decades, to centuries, and now millennia, the question, what's going on between death and this literal second coming, this literal end of the world, this literal apocalypse, as such a thing, is still to be understood that way. It's become more relevant. So do the spirits of the departed, are they asleep in God's bosom, resting as shades in the grave, or are they awake in Him? Are they awake in heaven already prior to a judgment day? So there's a couple kind of precedents or examples that maybe can be looked at in the biblical texts. So for example, in the Synoptic Gospels, there is the vision on the Mount of Transfiguration. So Peter, James, and John are brought by Jesus to a remote mountain, and they see Jesus transfigured in a vision as Christ. And they also see personages standing with him, which they identify as Moses and Elijah. And so these are the existence of previously living prophetic figures who are, alive and awake with God in the present for Peter, James, and John. And Peter, even after he sees this, his first impulse is, let's make three little shrines. I want to dedicate this space where we had this incredible vision. I want to make a shrine for Moses and a shrine for Elijah and a shrine here for Christ. And so that maybe also can be seen as an impulse for the veneration of saints. The problem here in terms of the question, though, the question of whether or not the spirits are alive in heaven or awake in heaven or asleep, is that both Moses and Elijah have Old Testament traditions where they may not have actually tasted death. So maybe God took Moses up and Elijah up in a chariot of fire, and neither one of them properly died ever, like Enoch, the antediluvian patriarch, which just enigmatically the book of Genesis says God took him. So it's possible here that the reason why it's Moses and Elijah that are awake is that they never actually died. Meanwhile, from the Old Testament, there's very little talk about afterlife, but one of the rare examples is found in the book of Samuel. So after King Saul has lost God's favor and no longer is receiving any revelation or guidance, he wants to know what he needs to do. And so he goes to the witch of Endor, who performs a necromantic ritual that wakes the shade of the prophet Samuel, who has died. And so Samuel is essentially described as having his shade is essentially sleeping with his ancestors, which is a Old Testament expression, and now he's being disturbed. And so this sort of has the implication that even great prophets are not actually awake with God in heaven, but are sleeping with their ancestors in the grave. Again, this is coming from an earlier text. The reality for the reason why this text expresses this is because this is before later ideas of afterlife were developed or injected into Judaism. But nevertheless, it's providing in the overall canon now as it exists some ambiguity for this question. We also have in Luke's account of the crucifixion a story where one of the criminals being crucified next to Jesus speaks on Jesus' behalf. So the other one has been kind of sitting there on the other cross, trash-talking Jesus, and this guy's like, hey, why are you doing that? When you're also sitting here being crucified and condemned. And then at the end of that kind of conversation, this one of the criminals being crucified, says to Jesus, "Remember me when you come into your kingdom, when you come in your kingdom." And then Jesus answers him, "Truly, I tell you, today you will be with me in paradise." And so, that seems to imply that he doesn't have to wait for a judgment day or a future resurrection. They're both going to die, and they will be together in paradise, which is another word for heaven. So there's not a huge amount through a lot of the Bible actually about heaven and how heaven works or anything like that, but some of the most extensive imagery of the heavenly court and its operations comes in the very elaborated visions and rich in imagery visions from the book of Revelation. And so, for example, in a vision of God's throne in the 4th chapter of Revelation, describes a whole bunch of things that are going on. So in addition to 4 winged creatures that are covered with eyes that become symbolically associated later with the 4 evangelists. So in addition to those guys that are surrounding the throne singing "Holy, Holy, Holy," there's also 24 elders of Israel that are singing other praises as they lay their crowns before the throne of God. So, in other words, other kinds of heavenly personages and elder of Israel makes it sort of sound like, maybe these are humans who are there in some kind of an afterlife in heaven. In addition to a heavenly court, and it doesn't have to be that, but it could be read that way. In addition to a heavenly court that is populated with elders of Israel and also the 12 apostles of the Lamb, we also hear that the prayers of the saints are present. So in Revelation 5, verse 6, we read, "Then I saw between the throne and the 4 living creatures and among the elders a lamb, standing as if it had been slaughtered, with 7 horns and 7 eyes, which are the 7 spirits of God sent out into all the earth. He, the Lamb, went and took the scroll from the right hand of the one who was seated on the throne. And when he had taken the scroll, the 4 living creatures and the 24 elders fell before the Lamb, each holding a harp and golden bowls full of incense. And the harp and the golden bowls full of incense, which are the prayers of the saints." So they then sing a new song. "You, O Lamb, are worthy to take the scroll and to break its seals, for you were slaughtered, and by your blood you ransomed for God saints from every tribe and language and people and nation. You have made them a kingdom and priests serving our God, and they will reign on earth." So this is a vision of saints, where saints here are essentially the members of the church who have been brought from every tribe and nation. So, and to create a new group that is not a kin group the way old Israel was, but instead is a group that have come together by being sanctified. And their prayers are present here in the form of bowls full of incense, in the imagery of heaven as presented in the vision here in Revelation. So it's ambiguous here whether these are the prayers of departed saints or whether this is the living saints. And again, this vision is being had in the 1st century by an apocalypticist who was very confident that the world was ending right now, within the next couple of years, not looking forward 2,000 years in the future and seeing visions about when the world would end then, but absolutely confident that it was going to happen in the next years of his own life. Nevertheless, so therefore that time frame, whether or not they're awake or not, the point is that saints and their prayers are present in heaven, and that informs the later understanding. So, despite this scriptural ambiguity then, the tradition that emerged within the proto-Orthodox communities that came together and became the foundation for the state-sponsored imperial Roman Church, they understood the souls of departed saints to be present in heaven with God, and thus able to be prayed for as intercessors. So you could contact, if you have some kind of contact with or connection with St. Stephen, the proto-martyr, you can pray to St. Stephen and say, in the same way that I stood up and got blamed by the locals for the kind of strong statements I was making, I have that connection with you, St. Stephen, and so I hope you will help me with this or that issue that I'm facing by then bringing my petition before God. So I wanted to say that the idea of valuing relics is not that alien. It's a natural human thing. People today continue, religious or not, to collect autographs, artifacts of celebrities. It's all kinds of motivations. In part, maybe this is out of a desire to feel a personal connection with somebody that they really like or somebody that they admire or use as a model in their life. So something like a game-winning baseball signed by all these players may give the owner of the collector, whoever has that relic, who might otherwise be unconnected to the actual team, it might give them a sense that they are part of a story that is important to them in some way. And so therefore these kinds of relics only become more and more valuable as we have all this more wealth in the world, and as people are even ever more focused on celebrity culture. So coming into personal contact with the relic of a saint, as for example, this is a relic of that Saint Perpetua, whose account we read. It's traditionally a relic of hers anyway, that has been preserved in this reliquary. At some point or other, someone felt that that was a relic of hers and has continued to provide that meaning for people. That may connect you if you go find this relic or are there. That may help you feel directly connected with her story of being a strong, literate Christian woman who held to her convictions, despite the fact that her father publicly begged her to just recant and that kind of a thing. In addition, inasmuch as the petitioner, the person who is engaging in a spiritual practice with the relic, understands that spirit of the saint to be directly in God's presence. So as you envision Saint Perpetua there in heaven, your physical connection to this relic by a kind of transitive property puts you into a direct kind of connection to a saint who is directly connected with God. Relics and shrines then of saints became very central to Christian worship throughout antiquity and the Middle Ages. Very famously, Constantine's mother, St. Helena, took an extended pilgrimage to biblical lands in order to identify all sorts of sites that are still seen as the traditional sites where various biblical narratives took place. People found tombs for her, which are identified and became the center of shrines and churches, including, most importantly, Jesus's tomb, traditionally located in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre now in Jerusalem, and in a space right next to that, also now within the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, important relics, including the relic of the true cross, as it's traditionally understood. That is to say, it was meant to be, by the time St. Helena found it 3 or 4 centuries later, the actual cross that Jesus has had. Historically, that's not a good provenance, but in terms of belief, this relic ended up having a lot of importance in Christian history. Also, this fueled the spiritual practice of pilgrimage in antiquity and throughout the Middle Ages. So as major shrines had different relics and developed a reputation that the saints paid special attention to their relics in various places. One of these important sites is the site of St. James the Great, one of the apostles, in Santiago in Galicia in Spain. That led to the development of a major pilgrimage route where people from all over Europe, especially England and France, would go all the way across France and northern Spain to Galicia, where they would participate in this ritual. And so part of the practice may be that either you were in need of healing, or you had done something that caused your reputation to just be terrible in the community, caused you to be outcast from the society. You take this major life-changing moment where you take all of this time out and go on this great pilgrimage, and all the shrines along the entire route of the Camino, of the pilgrim's path to Compostela. And then when you come back, people can say, okay, well, we can give this guy a second chance, because this proved that he was serious about turning a new page. So an example of that is Fulk III, Fulk the Black, Count of Anjou, part of the noble family that eventually produced the Plantagenets, the King Henry II of England, Richard the Lionhearted, Prince John, and so on. Fulk is an uncle of theirs. So Fulk caused the massacre. All of the counts and knights and warriors of his time in the end of the 10th and the beginning of the 11th century are constantly engaged in warfare, and a bunch of people had taken refuge in a church, which is supposed to offer sanctuary, but his knights, or he, burned it down anyway and killed them. And so this either hurt his reputation, or it caused his conscience to be pricked, or both. And so Fulk made the kind of pretty substantial pledge that he would go on a pilgrimage all the way from the west of France in the 11th century to Jerusalem, which was had still been in Muslim hands for centuries, and so it's going out of Christendom and into Islam, into this pilgrimage site. And having done that the one time and rebuilt his reputation, he later ordered a murder and felt he had to go do it again. and then he went 2 additional times, because at a certain point he had given pledges to honor and to protect pilgrims. And the Caliph of Egypt that owned Jerusalem destroyed the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. And so at a certain point, which is one of the causes that led to the Crusades, anyway, that Fulk had to go back in order to protect pilgrims, according to his oaths. The point is that this practice allowed someone to, like I say, turn a page, to show a very serious religious intent, and it was based essentially on the idea of going to a holy site, of setting yourself apart, putting yourself back on a new path. And indeed, this idea of pilgrimage and taking these long trips is the precursor to the modern tourism. This is where this kind of came from in the West. Like all practices, as people came to then value relics of saints, an economy for them developed. And so, as I mentioned, sort of provenance for even the best of the relics remains doubtful from a historical perspective. There's many centuries that separate when a biblical story is set and is meant to have taken place, whether it is historical or not. And so, who's to say whether there had been good tradition and word of mouth from the Christians that were still in Palestine talking to St. Helena when she got there, or who's to say that there might have been some opportunistic people who were saying, oh yeah, I can show you where that is, and producing things because she had so much money that she could pay for these fines out of her patronage. So there was significant incentive, no matter what, to produce outright frauds. There's this relic that isn't pictured here, is a reliquary that contains a sliver of the true cross. And this was a special gift from Pope Francis to King Charles III of the United Kingdom as a coronation gift. And we can be pretty sure that the relic that's inside there has been understood in Christian tradition to be part of the true cross for a very long time, and it may actually go back to St. Helena. I don't know the provenance of this particular relic. Nevertheless, it's also been quipped that if you were to get all of the slivers of the true cross and all the reliquaries in all of Christendom, you would have enough wood to build Noah's Ark, not just a cross. In other words, there was even understood as of the Middle Ages to be many, many duplicates of, there are multiple John the Baptist heads and things like that. So in other words, there were many different versions of theoretically the same relic, and many of the relics don't have good provenance. The idea that St. James the Great, the Apostle, ever made it to Spain is not historically tenable. So that's not what those relics are, even though it's been a center of an important Christian practice since the Middle Ages, though. Not everyone who could go on a pilgrimage, or especially an armed pilgrimage, which is what the Crusades were originally called. In fact, lots of people wanted to go on crusades, who shouldn't go on crusades as far as the popes or any military person was concerned, because they weren't helping in any way. And so a theory that developed in medieval canon law is that you could do something in lieu of actually going on a pilgrimage or actually going on a crusade. And this led to the idea of getting an indulgence or a papal certificate that recognized whatever substitute thing that you did as a valid substitution. So you'd get all the benefit of having gone on that crusade even though you didn't go on a crusade because you did something else. But the idea of an indulgence was quickly abused when they're given a monetary value and sold. So now suddenly you're not doing anything that's really a spiritual practice. You're giving money, and it's a way then for both the papacy, but also, again, fraudsters to raise money, get income. So, nevertheless, the eschatological question about whether or not saints were actually alive in heaven awake in heaven and interceding on the behalf of the praying people with God, or whether or not they were asleep until the day of judgment, that was still considered an open enough theological question that a medieval pope in Avignon, Pope John the 22nd, flirted with the idea of declaring as pope, as doctrine, his belief that the saints in fact do not enter God's presence until after Judgment Day. And the Pope continually preached that kind of thing, but didn't declare it as doctrine, and it caused a lot of consternation among contemporary churchmen and theologians who had long had tradition, who built on a tradition that said exactly the opposite. So by this time in the 14th century, when John the 22nd was Pope, an entire economy had grown around the idea of praying to saints for intercession. And so it is actually people pointed out how really weird and odd it is for a very worldly Pope to want to go about undermining this idea. So Christian churches relied on alms from visiting pilgrims visiting shrines containing these relics. The selling of the indulgences already were providing very needed income for Avignon's vast bureaucracy. And so it's just generally speculated that that in addition to just being maybe theologically naive himself, that John the 22nd was sort of, exercising his own ego, even though it was against his economic interest. He wanted to be able to say, I'm the Pope and I can say, how things work or how things aren't. I create doctrine and not. But what ended up happening instead is that the theology faculty of the University of Paris, for the first time, got together, did a study, and they absolutely opposed the Pope's proposition. And the Pope finally had to abandon his idea on his deathbed. And then his successor, Benedict XII, explicitly affirmed that those who are saved see God prior to the day of judgment. So he absolutely overturned John the 22nd's flirtation with the idea that the blessed anyway are asleep and will only see God after Judgment Day. And thus, Saints Perpetua and Felicity, as are understood in Catholic tradition to this day, as being in heaven and therefore available to intercede on your behalf if you offer them a prayer. And so this is a modern shrine to those saints at the National Shrine of the Immaculate Conception in Washington, D.C., the largest Catholic church in North America. So this remains the doctrine of the Catholic Church then to this day. So if we leave aside abuses of the system, so people producing fraudulent relics, of course that happened. The sale of indulgences, which the Catholic Church also later rolled back and said that this was an excess or an abuse. So now that we've had this whole broader context of the development of the idea of saints, especially in the West over the last 2,000 years, let's look at this question: are Protestants correct that there's something inherently problematic with the practice of venerating saints? So the kind of the partisan charge that Protestants make here is this just paganism warmed over? And I'm going to argue that it's really problematic when you start to identify things in Christianity and said, this is pagan, this is pagan, this is pagan, we got to delete this, we got to delete this. Because we're going to find out we're going to have to delete pretty well everything. Abrahamic religion is built atop pagan foundations. Got to go to the Cathedral of Syracuse a few years ago on the island of Sicily, and you can see built into one of the walls here, you can see the columns, and those are columns from the original temple to Athena. You can see the interior columns, you can see them even better on the inside. So the cathedral is simply a repurposed pagan Greek temple, and it originally then that Greek temple has survived because it was repurposed. It became, a Roman state, the Byzantine cathedral. Greek Orthodox ultimately, before Muslims conquered Sicily and rechristened it or repurposed it as a mosque. And then when the Normans conquered Sicily again from the Muslims, it became then a Latin cathedral, a Catholic cathedral. So in that same way, all Abrahamic religion is ultimately going to be built on pagan foundations, as polytheism is the earlier stage of religion before the development of monotheism and world religions. So we've had a bunch of lectures where we look at the origins of Yahwism, of the understanding of Yahweh, Jehovah, as the God of Israel in the Bible, and we see the footprints of the precursor practices and the footprints of an earlier pantheon within Israelite Canaanite religion. So we've had lectures on before God was God, and also on Baal and on Asherah. And so we've seen how, for example, Yahweh was originally not God, but were seen by his followers not as God with a capital G, but as a God, one of the sons of El, who is another god in the pantheon, but that Yahweh later absorbed El, and so El became the generic word for God, but also a name for Yahweh. That Yahweh at that time then had a consort, Asherah, his wife, and that ultimately his Yahweh and his Asherah, that Yahweh absorbed Asherah as well, that initially may have been seen as part of Baal or a lord in the northern kingdom, but ultimately in the final configuration absorbed Baal's roles, where Baals themselves, lords themselves, were seen not as gods anymore, but mere idols. And then the other remaining gods of the pantheon, the other sons of El, including gods like the angel of death and so forth, are reduced to being angels when the final biblical edit comes together to create not originally monotheism, but henotheism and monolatry, the idea that God, the God of Israel, is one God among other gods, that you are only to worship that God, and only later, in the latest stages of the development of the Hebrew Bible, do we get a full-on understanding of monotheism. So again, people sometimes say, well, does that mean that that shows that there's no such thing as God, the one God, because people didn't understand God that way at the beginning of the biblical tradition. And rather what that means is there's an evolution in human perception of the divine, and it is only at a later stage than what the Bible would like us to believe that Israelites began to see their God as God with a capital G. So I kind of want to look at this within monotheism, if there's a meaningful theological distinction going on here, because I kind of tend to think in some ways that there isn't. So if we take this kind of a cosmological org chart where we have monotheism, so there's the one, the divine source, the prime cause, the prime mover, the first cause. So one infinite, uncreated, eternal, divine source, which in turn is the cause of everything else, be it on the next layer of the org chart, created heavenly beings created by the one, and then also created humans, mortal humans. So if we think of those different layers of org chart. So if we take that as our basic template, and we then type into that, okay, that source, we call that source God. And in Christianity, we identify that God with three persons who are persons within, who each are God, but there's one God, one source, monotheism. So we nevertheless still consider ourselves monotheists, even though we recognize angels as a class of created heavenly beings, because angels, while heavenly, are not infinite, they're not uncreated, they're therefore not God with a capital G, and that would also be true in nominally more stringent monotheist religions like Islam, which still has angels, the angel Gabriel, who, for example, brings God's revelation to Muhammad. So, and again, living humans, the humans that are alive. So there is a heavenly level here, even though it's monotheist. So from the perspective of that layer, if we recognize at that layer saints, which is to say deceased humans that are in heaven, who again, they're not uncreated, they're not infinite, they are people who have died and been sanctified and who are with God, that doesn't really have create a theological problem. It's pretty well the same as understanding we had with angels. And technically, I would actually argue that this may not be that far off from the direction or the place that Greek philosophical paganism was itself going toward, because it was becoming, in many instances and many iterations, monotheistic, in the sense that Greek philosophers were arguing that there, yes, is one source, that the tradition of the gods that they had inherited are divine beings, yes, but beings that are not God with a capital G, God with lowercase g's, essentially, in that there's a time before which they didn't exist. At some point or other, Zeus, they might have equated Zeus with the one source as a name, but let's say in terms of the myths, there's a time when Poseidon is born, and so therefore he didn't exist eternally, the way the one source, the prime mover, the first cause, has always is self-existent. And in any event, since, as we've seen in historical evolution, the biblical angels are actually themselves remnants of the Canaanite gods, who are non-infinite, small g Greek gods, they don't seem that different from that. So I would argue that the monotheism, the important part of the monotheism, is the one source part, and this other level where we're talking about angels and gods and spirits, maybe blessed prophets that are in the bosom of God, saints and so forth, that's more muddy level, but it doesn't mean that we're not being monotheists when we have various ideas about that level, or maybe that there's no such level. In some ways, a more significant problem or a more significant question in terms of the veneration and asking for interventions, asking for an intercessor, is maybe what you're asking for. And so we talked about how some of these miracles where we're asking for healing, and we're maybe seeing God granting that as a miracle that shows that the saint is with God and is able to intercede because the intercession worked. And so that's certainly bringing up a different theological issue, which is a God that intervenes or sometimes does not intervene and is therefore potentially subjected to the problem of evil. But the path of having an interceder like that is really, this triggers the exact same way if you are a Protestant and believe you have a very direct relationship with God. Because once again, you can ask God for these same kinds of things. We had a really interesting experience of a speaker just the other day in my congregation who talked about experience he had where he'd lost his wallet. He had already begun to be angry at the idea of God who intervenes to help you find keys, or who does trivial things when terrible things like wars and genocide and ethnic cleansing and systemic inequality and that kind of thing is allowed to go unchecked. And yet nevertheless, he felt what he had identified historically as promptings that he should go back and look in a particular place. And he ultimately did that, and he found his wallet. And so he had trouble identifying how does he want to understand that in terms of the framework that he'd always had, or he'd always been taught about that kind of intervention through a direct relationship with God, as opposed to a intercessory relationship like with the saints. But ultimately, either one, I think, is really important, is our understanding of how God operates, and indeed whether if God does make those kinds of interventions, whatever the process is, does that then in turn make God responsible for all of the evil in the world that is not being stopped? So that, I think, is maybe more relevant question. Given the scale of creation, the magnitude of the infinite creator has to be remote. Even strict monotheism that allows no room for intercessors, that scoffs at the idea of persons within a trinity of one God, or that kind of thing. You nevertheless are relying on humans envisioning God, like this picture, in some very limited way. Big Sky Daddy, something like that, where you're thinking of God literally as your dad, or however you're thinking of God. It's such a limited way that it has to be alien to the divine source. And so, in my own perspective then, whether a person forms a personal relationship with the divine that includes an intercessor, on the one hand, like this shrine to the millennial saint with a relic of his in it, or one that is envisioning some kind of a personal relationship that is nominally direct, or whether one is really, really focused on a text like the Bible or the Quran. I think the problem with these relationships is not which path is being taken, but it happens when one literally starts to believe that this is literally the way God is. It's the literalistic conception, in my view, that then becomes an idol, or an obviously false conception of the divine that's going to lead you into a problem. And so that is my take on what are saints and the practice of the veneration of saints across Christian history and as it still exists in the present in some parts of Christianity. So I'm going to get a glass of water as Mike is collecting your questions. And Mike has got some of your names here of people who have been making donations, and we want to thank all of you for your support. So I want to thank Michael Kilgore, Galen DaCosta, the Ken Rector Foundation, Diane Patterson, Raphael Abreu, Chris Sneed, Donald Ewing, Mary Saleh, James Gill, Laurel May, Scott Heine, Regan Harrington, Craig Stout, Eric Nordquist, Peter Fell, Charles Reynolds, John Klinkner, the American Legacy Construction, Jason Bishop, Neil Diatley, Ron Wagner, as well as Jeroen Bavius, David Anderson, De Dennison 001, Permut Beer, VSP, Mester Miska, Airdye, Doug Wolf, Kerflek, how does it, I guess it's Kerflelk, Amarin, John E., Catherine, Crowley Bryan, Harrison Declan, Paul Hodson, Charles Francis, Crimson 90, Elodie, Salgado, Jim Huggard, LA Art Stream, we said Permit Beer before, so thanks again, Richard Riley, John Curtis Osborne, Susan Smith. Appreciate it, Suzanne Smith. I want to also thank people who've been donating during the lecture, so JM, Crimson 90, Dartha Rammer, Dave Anderson, and Fire Ever Living. I really appreciate it, guys. It really does allow us to be able to devote a lot of time to doing these, and I love it when we are able to do them every week. Magic Mike, thank you for your support. Magic Mike says, does the tradition of sainthood after death come from a concept in antiquity of being raised up or exalted after living an exceptional life? So this is one of the precedents, as I was kind of suggesting that we have, is that there is there's a small percentage of these where there's an idea of a person who's raised up or exalted, including Enoch, Moses, Elijah, maybe Mary might be in that category, Jesus. So some of these are part of that tradition, but I don't think that that's the main path, right? And so I think that the main path is that all the earliest members, the first members, are using that word saint, and then later generations are still using the word saint to describe the early members, and they're associating it especially with martyrdom, as opposed to being raised up or taken up into the heavens or exalted or something like that. Captain Sunshine asks, what is the path to sainthood in Community of Christ? So as I kind of said in the course of the lecture, the Community of Christ had as its tradition, at the heart of it was at the beginning, a restoration tradition with the idea of wanting to be the church as described in the book of Acts and to live out the New Testament church. And so we read that, or my ancestors read that, and they read the use of the word saint in the New Testament, and they took that as a name for what a member of the church should be. And so technically, when you are baptized into Community of Christ, when you become confirmed as a member, you are one of the saints, as we would call it, the saints here in the latter days. But and we'll still use that when we talk about my ancestors, when we say the saints moved to Missouri in order to build their new Zion and independence. And so we're not as likely because of hopefully humility, but you don't want, it's maybe a little embarrassing to call yourself a saint, so we're not as likely to say it. But the path is get confirmed and you're a saint, Captain Sunshine. The parasocial audience says, do Anglican Protestants use saints only as positive examples and not as intercessors? I mean as examples of living a good life, not for supernatural after-death intercession. So I know that the more main, so Anglicans are always operating in this middle path, middle ground between full-on Protestants and Catholics, because so the Lutherans have and other Protestants have a convention that says, we don't believe in intercessors. We believe in having a direct relationship. But the Anglican tradition, sometimes people say that it's founded by Henry VIII. It's not. Henry VIII breaks the Anglican Church, which had existed since the time of Augustine of Canterbury, in other words, as an apostolic successor and part of the Western Latin Church. He simply breaks the communion that the pre-existing Anglican Church had with Rome. And so they brought a lot more things with them. There is in the Anglican Church, there's some of the, there's a bunch of people who were interacting with Protestants, and especially the more hardcore Puritans. A lot of them were, for example, iconoclasts, and so they also knocked the heads of saints off of statues in different churches in England, and they got rid of all the paint and things like that in order to purify or make more simple them. But I can't tell you. I know that the Anglican Church still recognizes saints. My presumption would be what you're saying is the correct, that it's probably not prayed to as intercessors, but rather are models of a good life. But actually, I don't know the answer to that for Anglicans specifically. Entropically Tutoring says, how are the miracles evaluated by the Catholic Church? And so there's a formal church bureaucracy. There's that has you have an actual whatever it's called within the church, a group within the church that is in charge of doing these investigations. And so it's a very formal procedure in the Catholic Church, and they take testimonies and they evaluate whether they think that those are credible. James Sweeney, thank you for your support. Why do Jehovah's Witnesses describe every other Christian as pagan and themselves as untainted? They seem obsessed with purging paganism, even birthdays and holidays. So this is a trajectory that Protestantism is on, right? And so once you start on that path, the different new religious traditions that came out of the Second Great Awakening in the United States in the early 19th century, that includes the Restoration tradition, like the Stone Campbell movement and the Latter-day Saint movement, but it also includes the Millerites, which includes the Adventists and Jehovah's Witnesses, and so that's the trajectory that particular sect of kind of this new a new religion of Christianity has taken it down. A new religion within Christianity, Jehovah's Witnesses. And so they are especially obsessed with that, like you say. And so that includes, like, you can't go have birthdays, you can't celebrate Christmas and those kind of things, because they seem, they're understood anyway as part of the pagan inheritance that they want to get rid of. Josh Bedford, do you think the principle of sainthood veneration is something worthwhile in the modern age? So, for example, you're suggesting that Martin Luther King Jr. could maybe be seen as a saint, or does mainstream culture do just fine with Marvel superheroes and the like? Yeah, so I think in some ways Marvel superheroes, so in the same way that medieval saints are a continuation, if they are, of the pagan mythology of the gods running around and doing different things, so there's if they're fulfilling a same kind of function, where hagiographies or lives of saints performing great feats, those are part of popular culture in the Middle Ages, and they were the sources, for example, of plays when as plays were revived. In that sense, there is a trajectory that takes us probably to Marvel superheroes, which is to say that people, that part is, bringing in entertainment. Some cases those are teaching moral stories, like Spider-Man continually, his same story is, with great power comes great responsibility kind of thing. And people also like supernatural magic, and so they like it just as much when the gods are doing magical things, when the saints are doing magical things, when superheroes are doing magical things. And in terms of non-magical saints like Martin Luther King Jr., I think that's in some ways we have a secular process of venerating leaders whose life and work that we respect. Like Gandhi is another example in that regard. But then part of the problem always ends up being we have so much information and so many details about people's lives. It's very hard for a person to live an entirely perfect and blameless life, and so then there's also often debunking that goes along with, but I don't know how much of that I know about in the case of either Martin Luther King Jr. or Gandhi, but it's a problem that other heroic figures maybe face. Dear 978 says, if James's congregation was called the poor or the saints of Jerusalem, why isn't the word capitalized in Scripture? Shouldn't it be the poor with a capital P, saints in Jerusalem with a capital S? So there's no, in the original text here that's coming out of Greek and Latin, there is no capitalization. The original text in Greek and the Latin translation. This is a modern decision to whether to do it or not. There's no, I've been talking about God with a capital G. Well, that's again a modern convention. Capital letters are, the Romans only had capital letters. Lowercase letters are invented in the Middle Ages, and so this is a modern convention. So it's a stylistic choice that is being made by the translators. Music says, what was the Greek use of saint before the emergence of Christianity? I guess we'd have to look at it. So it's be sanctified or holy, and so I'm presuming it would be used for the same kinds of things within the old religions of the Greek world, which is to say what we now call paganism. And so saint would have been hagia, or haios would have been an adjective that means holy, and so I'm sure it would have been applied to the priests and priestesses, maybe to temples, shrines, sanctuaries, to rituals, that kind of thing. And so I think that the word would have been a pre-existing word before it just gets taken up by Christianity to describe similar things. Jerry Edsel Jr., thank you for your support. He says, how many true martyrs are there, the ones that didn't want to live but die with their own choice? The ones who didn't want to live but die. Oh, I'm not sure what you mean. So Jerry, so like, is there like so martyr seeking? So if you wanted to, there's a little bit of a razor's edge here for the tradition of martyrdom. If you were actually actively seeking to be martyred, that's not the thing to do, because then you're actually being motivated by vainglory. You're supposed to be trying to not be martyred, but that said, once they've got you in their clutches, the Roman leaders who are trying you and so forth, then it's perfectly allowed for you to you're not supposed to recant, and so you become a true martyr by not recanting. If they let you go anyway, then you didn't get martyred, but if they kill you, then you do. In terms of how many there are, we don't have good numbers. There's no way to number that. I read when we having fairly contemporary accounts like that. One, it may be a contemporary account, maybe a first-hand account of Saint Perpetua. I like to go to that one because we can see that as an example of how it works. And we also have, from the other side, we have a pagan governor, Pliny the Younger, who writes his own correspondence with the emperor, explaining his procedures for his conducting kind of investigation and persecutions of Christians. And so we have a sense of how it worked, but we don't have like a census of how many actual martyrs there were. Wayne's World of Science and Technology says, has John read Operation Chaos by Poul Anderson? That's the very first place I heard of the Johannine movement. I have not read that. I'm presuming this is a science fiction book, but I haven't read Poul Anderson among the classics. I was always a big Isaac Asimov and Larry Niven fan and other writers, but I never got to him. Mark Conti comments, growing up in Rome, I had a lot of exposure to Catholicism. I'd say that saints were far more important than the Bible. The latter was only quoted during services or the catechism. I would say saints in Italian Catholicism took the place of the city gods from paganism, but I haven't looked into it enough. So there is I would agree with you that there is probably a similar role that saints take in terms of patronage for a city, or probably the other experiences you're having there is patronage for an individual church. And so that was also, there were local gods in paganism that were dealing with, the individual crossroads that you'd be walking around in Rome, or the square, or the particular marketplace that you were going to. So, and then you would have also had your household gods. And so again, there would have been a way of experiencing the divine in a very personal and localized sense through understanding inherited traditions, that those are gods or household gods, penates, that kind of a thing, and that social space, or that mental or spiritual space, is later replaced in Rome by saints, and continues on to the present. And so, as you would point out, I've tried to kind of make the case, I was have to make the case to people who don't grow up where you did. If you grew up in North America where I did, I grew up in Minnesota where Catholics are a minority, and I assumed that everybody was a Lutheran. In that kind of a growing up context, you just assume that Christianity has always been super Bible focused, and that's a false assumption. Rain Weber says, when the saints go marching in, who are they? So this is from that great Black American spiritual, when the saints go marching in, when the saints go marching in. Oh, I want to be in that number when the saints go marching in. And so what's the number? The number is the 144,000, the elect from the book of Revelation. Where are the saints marching in? These are the saints that are mentioned in the book of Revelation, that is to say, members of the church in the first understanding of what the word saint means to the author of Revelation, writing at the end of the first century. And so it's when the members of the church are coming into the heavenly city of the New Jerusalem, when they go marching into that, that's who they are. And so the Christians, African American Christians, at the time of the antebellum South, they wanted to be numbered among those saints when God comes and makes the world an equitable place instead of a place that has slavery. K. Tempest Bradford. Why is stiff-necked used as an insult in the Bible, and what does it mean or signify? I think that my impression, I don't know this for sure, my impression of this is that I expect that this is a person who is willing to show deference. And so if you're going to, if you're ready, prepared to bow and show honor to God, when you fall into the ground and you say, the glory of the Lord, or I've seen the Lord. I think a person whose neck is stiff and refuses to do that, maybe that would be my impression, but I'd have to look it up to make sure what other people say about it. Hislang says, did saints become popular because they were able to syncretically subsume pagan deities? So sometimes, yes. So there are definitely examples of that where, there is a local pagan deity that has a long, rich tradition. We saw the picture in Syracuse that I showed of there was a temple of Athena that was, one of the patrons of that Greek colony, and that same shrine was not even torn down. It was simply walled in and made into a cathedral. It was a deliberate policy when Pope, I think it's Pope Gregory the Great, when he's writing to people, he tells them, he tells Augustine of Canterbury as he's working on converting the Anglo-Saxons who have been pagans, he says, well, just go ahead and build the church on top of the shrine, and if all the people who were coming to do whatever they were coming to do for that pagan Anglo-Saxon deity, if they keep coming, now tell them our story. So there was a deliberate policy at some point of doing that, but not all the saints are that way. So some of the saints have have their own traditions that go back, like Saint Perpetua, or that also are based on biblical stories, like all of the apostolic saints, or Mary Magdalene, or Mary the mother of Jesus, Mary the mother of God. In other words, that have a literary antecedent, although they can, in the case of Mary, absorbed like great mother goddess shrines in some places, let's say, where there was a particular importance of veneration for the divine feminine, and Christianity otherwise is somewhat lacking in its imagery of the feminine divine, and so Mary is able to take on that role, and has been able to for thousands of years. Michelangelo says, regarding superheroes, Latin America has a lot of unofficial saints that either have American origin, so the Maya or Inca, who are deceased idols, or deceased and venerated in informal shrines called animatas. So that's really interesting, yeah. That process that I was describing, with Gregory the Great, where he overtly talks about it in the conversion of Anglo-Saxon England, I don't think that policy went away. Like you say, when the Spanish and the Portuguese especially the Spanish, though, are working on Christianizing indigenous Americans, the process continued, and so the syncretism is brought. Some of the existing traditions are essentially given a Christian washover, and a god becomes a saint, and so forth. Anders and Lister, thank you for your support. Normative says, I'd be interested in hearing John talk on how the tradition of valorizing real or imagined persecution shapes modern politicized evangelical Christianity. So that is that's a negative. I would say it shapes it in a very negative way. So part of the problem of a persecution complex. So Christianity's roots was that it was a tiny minority that was unimportant and faced periodic persecution. Modern evangelical Christianity in the United States is not a tiny minority. It is the group that has Christianity has been the default group in North America. So Christianity has not been in any way persecuted. It's actually has all kinds of special status within North America. So yes, we have established rules that have tolerance for all religions and freedom of religion, but there is a default benefit, for Christians. And I experienced that personally here in Toronto, I believe, when we were creating this sanctuary. So there is the basic zoning rules and laws for having a place, which is a place of worship, are that you have to have a certain amount of parking. And we're like right in the heart of the oldest part of the city in a downtown. We don't have any parking at all. And so I had to go to the city council and get a variance for that. And they were all very, all the city councilors were all, oh yeah, I don't think my church has any parking either. And so in other words, there were all of these different ways where I felt like, well, I got, even not the opposite of persecution. I don't know if every city councilor, we have a very diverse city, and they probably would be very nice to mosques as well, but I don't know if they would get the same treatment that I got. So I think that this persecution complex that a lot of politicized evangelical Christians have is a distortion of the history and not relevant to the present. JB, is there a tradition of saints in Judaism? I don't know about that in the present Judaism. Certainly not. I think the saints in the terms of not in terms of this intercessing prayers. I don't think. Not familiar with it enough with it in terms of whether this kind of thing is happening. Certainly the idea that there are intercessor levels in heaven is growing out of Second Temple Judaism. So we've read a lot of these apocalyptic scriptures that talking about the court of heaven just being populated with all of these different angels, and also beings like Enoch that are taken up. And so there is a need in Second Temple Judaism, because of the remoteness of God, whose name you're not supposed to even say, to have other levels of the divine. But I'm not sure how much of that has survived to the present day in rabbinic Judaism. I don't think it's central to it. That memory might have fallen by the wayside. Fastball flakes. What are the most impressive relics that have solid provenance? Well, so the way that you would have them, be impressive, it depends on what saint you like the best, or something like this. But so a relic with a solid provenance would be the body of Saint Thomas a Becket, let's say. So if you really like the story of Thomas a Becket and his martyrdom and things like that, you're in luck, because there was witnesses to his death. We know his body was identified. It was able to be kept. So his relics would have a very solid provenance. And so it depends on, some kind of a figure like that, who we know is historical, that we know the body has been, or other relics have been kept from the time of their death. K. Tempest Bradford. On an episode of the 90s TV show Mysteries of the Bible, Rabbi Lawrence Schulman talks about how, I think, when rabbinical Judaism was developing after the war, that is to say after the Roman Jewish wars, that the rabbis pulled back on angels because they'd multiplied so much over time, culminating with the books of Enoch. They were being prayed to and asked to for intercession, and it felt like a backward slide into paganism or polytheism. So that's one of the reasons why certain books didn't make it into their canon. And so do you think this had any impact on Protestant feelings about saints? So that would have been my speculation too. So I'm glad that you had that about part of the idea of rabbinic Judaism was, a lot of this stuff, this direction that we had gone into in terms of Hellenizing Judaism, that ended with what, as far as the rabbis were concerned, is the calamity that is this Christians running around doing all this craziness. So we want to tank down on a lot of that, and so go back to an earlier understanding in the older parts of the tradition, and so therefore not putting things like the Book of Enoch and later Second Temple books into the Bible. I'm not sure if that had a direct bearing on Protestant feelings about saints. It definitely, the Protestants removed a bunch of books from their canon of the Bible based on what the rabbis had decided and created in terms of their canon, which is why, in just a very odd way, the Catholic Old Testament canon and the Orthodox one, has all of these extra books that are the books that had been translated into Greek and were part of the Septuagint, whereas the canon of rabbinic Judaism and Protestantism is the same, not Orthodoxy and Catholicism. But I think that the Protestants had their own feelings about the saints, which are more directly related to their understanding of the inheritance from pagan Rome. What the guy who was talking about having grown up in Rome was the point that he was making. DLR 978 says, does Genesis mention the creation of angels? No. So when I'm saying that angels are created, that's not I think that's not sourced. It's not saying like on the second day God created angels or anything like that, but rather that's a theological statement. So Christians believe that the only thing that is being that is uncreated is the first cause, which is to say God, which we understand in three persons. So the Father, Christ, and Spirit. So only God is uncreated. Therefore, everything else is created, including angels, even if the Bible doesn't explicitly mention it. Bo the Wolf says, have there been individuals who have been desainted? I think that there probably have been. So I think that probably what might happen is that that someone will have been understood to be a saint because of an unwell-sourced legend. So in other words, not somebody who will have gone through that whole canonization process, but just somebody from tradition who was understood to be a saint, who might then later get stricken from the list because we understand, well, that's not actually a person, it's just a myth or a misreading of something. But it probably is a procedure for it because the Catholic Church has all kinds of incredibly procedures, canonical procedures for all of these sorts of things. Jerry Edsel, thank you for your support. Jerry asks, should we thank Paul or Saul for saints? How many saints have a relevance of jobs, life, or object? For example, stoneworkers have a saint. Does everything have a saint? I think in general, yes, everything does have a saint because when there start to be new things, there's a committee within the Catholic Church that assigns a saint to it. So when the internet started to exist, they needed to say, well, we don't have a saint for that because there's never been the internet before. The internet's a new thing. So some committee or other within the Catholic Church assigned Saint Isidore of Seville, if I'm not mistaken, to be the patron of the internet because of Isidore's important work in taking the bulk of Greco-Roman classical inheritance and trying to systematize it into a great encyclopedia so that it could be preserved through the Middle Ages. And so in that same way, that seemed fully relevant to what the internet was doing. And so therefore, the internet has a patron. So yeah, I'm sure, like you say, stoneworkers have a saint. Everybody has a saint, for the different jobs. If it's a brand new job, it may not have it yet, but it would be based on presumably relevance or similarity to some other previous job that already has a saint. Michelangelo says, what is John's favorite saint story from antiquity or from medieval history? Well, I mean, I had mentioned Thomas à Becket. That is right at the heart of the kind of medieval time period that I really like to study, is that the time period of the Norman and Angevin kings, the development of the Capetian monarchy in France, that kind of in that time frame. One of my favorite kings is Henry II, who's Becket's great friend and then later rival antagonist, the guy who is responsible for getting him killed. And so probably maybe that story is one of my favorite saint stories. Although I don't think that Becket acts in a particularly saintly way. I'm not sure that I'm rooting for him the whole time, but it's also very interesting how quickly his saintly reputation happens immediately after his martyrdom. And so I find that also very, very interesting as an example of how saints were understood and venerated and came to be venerated in medieval history. And then, as an aftermath of that, I'm also a huge fan and love the Canterbury Tales, which are, this great, later medieval literature, beginning of Middle English literature that is a whole series of stories about pilgrims telling stories on their way to the shrine of the Holy Blissful Martyr, Thomas à Becket. So another connection to Becket that I think is probably, therefore, maybe my famous one that I can think of offhand. Dartharama. Why are 14 saints incorruptible and others aren't? Is that a medical choice or a Vatican choice? So Dartharama, I'm not sure which of the. I don't know the details about that. In terms of one of the qualities that is generally understood in the kind of the legendarium of saints is that like you bury the person and then you open up the tomb a little later and then it turns out, wow, that person didn't decay at all. They must be a saint. And so that was just one of the signs of sanctity, of beatification, and so incorruptibility. So if there are a special list of 14 that are fully incorruptible, I don't know the details on that. John Phelps, what are the most famous Protestant saints, if any? So a lot of Protestant churches, rejected the idea of saints, and so don't consider their different leaders to be saints. I think that therefore the main church that are Protestant that would still be creating saints or maybe understanding there to be new saints would probably be the Anglican Church. Although I didn't look up what their process is for that and how they are recognizing new saints or who the famous Protestant saints might be subsequently. In general, there are different Protestant martyrs, and so maybe people that were persecuted for, and died for, causes of religious freedom or trying to abolish slavery or those sorts of things, but they're not necessarily formalized as saints within Protestantism because of the difference understanding and kind of antagonism that Protestants have had towards the tradition of saints. Prashant Sharma says, one of my professors said that the majority of medieval saints were from the upper classes, and I wonder if that's true. So the ones that would be named, the ones that we would have relics for. I mean, I was talking to you about the main example that I use is Saint Perpetua, and why do we have her firsthand written account? Why does the Roman governor, talk specifically to her and try to, beat her dad in front of her, try to get her to not do that? Because she's a noble woman, so that's why her name is known. That's why her case became famous. And so, nevertheless, we say her name in conjunction with Saint Felicitas, who was a servant girl. And so there's an example of somebody from the upper class and somebody from a commoner, and the commoner maybe is only getting her story told because she was martyred with the person of the upper class who was therefore able to write it. But this is going to be true for all of history that survives from antiquity in the Middle Ages. The only people that were writing are the elite. The names that survive are primarily the upper classes, and that's so it's even rare for us to be able to then find like the stories, let's say, of women. But that's what we have to look through because that's what survived and come down to us. It doesn't mean the majority of people that suffered and were martyred or were killed. Lots of people, the majority of them would have been from the lower classes, but we don't have their relics or stories or names. Michelangelo says, what's your opinion on stigmatas like St. Francis and Padre Pio and their relation to miracles and sainthood? So my feeling about anything that involves, let's say, actual physical magic, I'm not interested in anything that is like an actual, some kind of physical manifestation, some supernatural thing that would have occurred in the physical world. The relevance of a stigmata, the idea of feeling the wounds of Christ in a spiritual sense, feeling that you're having that connection, and having. So to the extent that we're insisting that that's literal and physical, I'm not interested in it. To the sense that it's a spiritual feeling, I think that it could be incredibly meaningful. So that would be my how I generally view all of those kinds of things. Anders and Lister says, since next week is about anti-Semitism, I think it's actually 2 weeks from now is about anti-Semitism. Next week is about the Ark of the Covenant. Could you also discuss why Jews don't believe Jesus was the Messiah? Yes, I will also talk about that in our discussion of the Gospel of John. Also was wondering if there was an official statement stating such. What was the discussion? So there was not. It's not like there's like a Pope of Judaism. So it's not like there was like one leader. There would have been the high priest in Jerusalem, but by the time where Christians were anything to worry about, the temple had been destroyed and there isn't any high priest anymore. And so really by the time Judaism gets reorganized under the rabbis, there's already been a long-standing division. Everybody who's continuing to be Jewish and not Christian, who is gathering together under the leadership of the rabbis, they've already decided that that these claims that the Christians are making are absolutely bogus, false. That they don't believe that that's not how they understand the Messiah to exist. But yeah, we can talk about it. So we have examples when we're talking about the Gospel of John. That community remembers when they were expelled from the synagogues, presumably because they kept on testifying to everybody around them that Jesus was the Messiah, and nobody wanted to hear that anymore. And so yes, and the rabbis, have some explanations in their writings about why, making their own kind of anti-Jewish partisan ideas that also are not going back to the historical Jesus, but based on what they're reading of Christian texts and their arguments against it. Jerry Edsel, thank you for your support. Who was the old guy that held his book up and the opposite ran their axe through the Bible and his head? I believe he set the situation up to become a martyr. So he's like holding his book up and somebody runs their axe through the Bible and his head. So I don't know who that was. That story's not ringing a bell to me, Jerry. I don't know. So one last question here. Captain Sunshine. Do we have a saint for us heretics? I don't know. I think there's lots of saints that you can look back to for heretics, depending on your definition of heresy. So for, let's say, people who don't like all of the supernatural miracles and things like that in the Bible, but do like the edifying stories or principles that are taught through parables. You have a saint like Thomas Jefferson who goes through and slices the text up and gets rid of all the parts you don't like. And so that might be a saint to whose model you have to pull from the tradition the things that you like and want to continue to uphold, and then while you get rid of the rest in celebration, your heretical celebration. But I don't know. There's probably a lot of other, depending on what the form your heresy takes and what's important to you. There's lots of other examples of people who, did things that you can look to and say, I like how he did that, or she did that. So thank you guys so much. There was a lot of great discussion, lots of great questions. Next week we're going to talk about the Ark of the Covenant. So your homework is watch Indiana Jones Raiders of the Lost Ark between now and next Tuesday.